Hi, everybody. Happy to be here. I feel like we're on tour. This is Kelsey and I's third time giving this presentation. So we're from Banfield Pet Hospital. Kelsey, if you want to jump to the next slide. Banfield is one of the largest veterinary companies in the country. We primarily provide preventive care services to cats and dogs. We are owned by Mars Incorporated. Yes, that is the candy company. Yes, we get great prices on candy products. Mars started in pet food, and then they eventually ventured into pet care. To answer your question of why we're owned by a candy company.
Gonna do some quick intros. I introduced myself briefly earlier, but I'm the Manager of Operational Reporting and Insights at Banfield, and our team is responsible for the majority of the reporting that goes out to our hospitals and field management. That's about 3,000 users. And we also cover insights for our operations and finance departments at our central headquarters. And I have a passion for user-centric BI, which I'll be talking about in a little bit, and a little bit of background on our journey at Banfield with Power BI. We had grassroots growth. I was one of the early analysts working with it. There were just a handful of us using the free desktop download, and we have moved to multiple premium nodes and a few hundred pro licenses over the course of a few years. So that is primarily why Microsoft wanted to feature us at their Business Application Summit, which is where this presentation started. So it's been a really fun journey over the last few years. Rebecca?
And I'm Rebecca McCarthy. I'm the Interim Manager for our Data and Analytics team, which mostly consists of our data warehouse team, and we also control some data strategy for our company. And my passion lies in strong collaborative relationships between technical users and business teams, and the way that you can push your business forward when you're really fostering strong relationships there. And collaboration is a theme you'll hear a lot through this presentation, as Kelsey discusses user-centric BI development and talking about the collaboration between both of our teams and within overall Power BI administration and governance to make this a successful implementation. So a bit more information about our company. We have nearly 1,100 hospitals nationwide. We see more than 9.5 million pet visits annually. We have roughly close to 20,000 total associates within the corporate office and across the field. 3,500 of those are veterinarians. And our associate pool is largely comprised of females and millennials. We do have one of the largest pet health data stores out there, with 8.5 million records coming in nightly from our hospitals. We hold roughly 11 terabytes of raw medical data, and we use a lot of that data for analytics. As you can see, we have roughly 120,000 daily sessions against our database. And that data really allows us to lead the industry forward. We provide a lot of research outcomes and publications to the rest of the veterinary industry. And then looking at the landscape of analytics at Banfield, so we have a variety of different data users in our company. We've got some people who are more report builders. They're maybe have lower tech skills, don't necessarily know coding languages. So they rely a lot on those plug and play BI tools that we have to get the data that they need. And then across our business, each function, each of our major functions has their own group of analysts who are using some of that plug and play, but they'll also be directly querying against our groomed and organized data in our warehouse. And then we also have a smaller group of data scientists, and they might be using more of that real-time data that we're capturing and storing in the cloud for machine learning, creating algorithms for some predictive analytics. And we don't necessarily have our own cloud-based data store presently. We share a space with our parent and sister companies, but we are exploring options to adopt more of a hybrid data storage model between on-prem and cloud-based. But right now we're primarily on-premises. And then we have our IT data team supporting, that structure. We have our team of data warehouse engineers, and then our Power BI administrator sits on our team, as well as another data systems analyst who helps support analytics across our business.
So now we're going to jump into the user-centric BI presentation. And similar to the last presentation, we're actually going to talk for user-centric BI that we've learned over the course of our implementation. So user-centric BI is about building a system that prioritizes the user's benefit and experience, and to provide some context as to the big project.
Good.
How long is your stuff?
Sorry about that.
Hello.
Half an hour, so what?
Okay.
Sorry. No big deal.
So we, right, the project, just to give some context as to the project.
Go for it, sorry.
No, okay. So to give some context as to the project that we have been working on, it was a structured reporting rollout to our field that includes our hospital associates, leaders, and regional management. We have about 18,000 possible users, but about 3,000 active. And so you want to keep that in mind with some of these examples I'm giving. It was a quite large scale project. So we're going to jump into the first one, which is finding the right people for requirements. Next, there we go. So as you're working through requirements, a key thing to start with is to define your user personas as you're getting started. So who are going to be those key users, and how do you define them? So at Banfield, we have two different sides of management in our field. We have the operations side and the medical side. And our reporting is kind of focused for operations, but it ties so closely to the medical, and we needed that representation. And so we had separate personas for operations versus medical leaders. And then we also have different levels of management, and we had different personas and representation at those levels as well. It worked for us to cast a net in terms of getting users involved in requirements from the start. We actually started with about 60 people in these initial conversations, and that enabled us to get a sense of who was interested and up for the commitment, because in our case, it was a decently long-term commitment from requirements through testing for several dashboards that were going to thousands of people. So once you have that wide net and you have some initial conversations, then go ahead and narrow down the group. You don't want too many cooks in the kitchen when you're talking about requirements, or you'll end up with a lot of negotiation on your plate because people tend to want different things. It's also good to have decent representation of your user base. So you don't necessarily want all the rock stars. You might want people who, perform in the kind of middle of the group, people who are up for the time commitment and also can work independently, as you'll probably want them using this reporting as a part of their job during your testing phase. It's also really helpful to have some one-on-one conversations as a part of requirements gathering. An example that really changed the course of our project, someone had missed the requirements meeting, and we followed up one-on-one. And in that session, she actually provided her perspective that we were headed in the wrong direction with one of our key initial dashboards, and it would be too cumbersome for our field leaders to use. So we actually changed our entire direction because of that convo. And I think when people are providing feedback like that, it can be hard to do it with a bigger group, especially if they're more on the introverted side. So having, making space for those individual conversations can be really helpful. Interviewing to understand the business. So I think our instinct when we go into requirements gathering conversations is to ask for what people want to see. But what I found is that requests are often similar to what people have had in the past, or maybe don't meet very good visualization practices. What our people had in the past was a static data table with hundreds of numbers on a single page, about 40 metrics by the 52 weeks of the year. And there were oftentimes dozens of pages of that. for like different hospitals and things. And a version of that had been around for 15 years. So people were very much stuck in their ways of looking at that data table. So we didn't want to ask them what they wanted to see necessarily. Especially if you're using a new tool, and they referred to this in the earlier presentation, is to demonstrate the possibilities and kind of open up people's minds about what could be in the new tool and show them that can be helpful. And then the next couple are really about understanding how the business functions and really questioning what people need to support to drive the business. An example I have on this one of the reports that we were transitioning had some metrics by the day of the week in a data table. And we could have looked at that and transitioned that into a data table, but we really pushed on what the purpose of these weekday metrics were. And what we heard is that it was about creating a balance between the clients and the associates between the weekend and the weekdays. So during the weekdays, the associates wanted to work. On the weekends is when the clients wanted to come in. And we need to create a balance between our labor and our clients. And that's what that reporting was all about. And once we really understood the business function, we could put together some visualizations that helped highlight exceptions to when there was an imbalance or something like that. So we were really able to provide better quality reporting once we knew the business purpose. So negotiating and iterating, we heard a bit about that on the last call as well. So one thing that I found quite helpful during development is to balance innovation and familiarity, especially if you're talking about a really wide user base. That'll help people adopt if it's not like everything brand new, crazy fun visuals. Really trying to find a balance there might make it more realistic. Also maintaining focus. So you can't meet everyone's preferences with a dashboard. You can't satisfy everybody. So it's good to get a sense from your requirements group and prioritize based on when you're hearing the same thing multiple times or what's really going to provide those value adds. And then you can leverage self-service for people's personal preferences or those one-offs where they really like to manage in a certain way. Focus on usability. So the more user-friendly an application is, the less time is required for training and dealing with people turning over and making sure they're up to speed and things like that. So I really like to just make an application as easy to use as possible, especially when you're talking about a wide user base. From my perspective, I think it's hard for us as developers and managers to understand the pain points that our users are experiencing. So making sure that you're seeking feedback. One thing that we did pretty early on in our project after we'd released a couple dashboards was to do a survey. And what we were hearing is that navigation was people's biggest pain point because there were pop-ups coming up and there were visuals overlapping and they couldn't get to that drill button or they didn't know where it was and things like that. And it honestly hadn't really crossed our minds. We were so used to using Power BI at that point. You saw those little idiosyncrasies, but it was something that we were able to improve once we knew it was the main problem for our users. And also just, work to improve adoption in whatever way you can by seeking that feedback. And finally, don't let adoption be an option. So I think there are some ways that you can make your application irresistible. A few things that we have done over the course of our implementation is to provide new data sources that maybe people haven't been able to leverage in the past to give them the leg up, have your data available more frequently, so refresh more frequently than maybe they've had it available in the past. And then metrics that tie to pay or bonuses can also be really helpful with getting people into your application. So what I find is if it becomes What'd you say?
I said, if you can make that happen, that's awesome. Yeah, you must see my report 10 times to get your bonus. Oh, adoption's going to skyrocket.
Yep, we have a bonus report, and that certainly motivates people to come in it estimates over the course of the year what their bonus will be at the end of the year. So yeah, that can be really helpful. And if it becomes routine because they're going in for that, really important stuff, they'll find more value over time. So instead of a demo at the MBAS, we just did a couple of screenshots and anonymized them, but I'll talk through that a little bit. So I mentioned we had this huge data table with like 40 metrics by 52 weeks with tons of numbers, and this was how we transitioned that report. So what we ended up doing, I mentioned finding that balance between familiar and innovation, and so we had them land on a dashboard, had more visuals and a lot of different things than they were used to, but then they could also look at a data table that had a lot more flexibility than what they'd had previously and much scaled back in terms of the number of metrics. So a few things that I would want to call out here around like making things easy for the user is we were sure to have all our buttons in the same color blue. So it really drew their attention to where they could click and see more information. We also did that in our drill up, drill down buttons in the top right of our charts. They would highlight in that blue color. You can change the color of those. And that indicated to people that those were buttons as well. One thing we learned when we were diving into the business need was your instinct is like you want to highlight where there's problems, right? But it was really important for our managers to highlight where there were successes. And because they needed to motivate their teams, like, oh, you fantastic doing this X, Y, and Z last week, like keep it going. And that was even more important to them to seeing where there were problem areas. So that's what we tried to do in the bottom left-hand corner, highlighting like best evers when they hit top pet and revenue numbers. We had a revenue streak, like how many weeks in a row they've hit their revenue target. And we did some rankings to kind of promote some friendly competition and, so that the managers could call out when they've, are number one or number two in something like that. And we also did some things like helped them calculate how many more pets or, dollars per appointment they needed to bring in when they were, if they weren't meeting their target for the period. So things like that that were new and provided them some motivation and tools to do their job in a new way. What else? So I did mention on the next page is our familiarity, and we just blurred all this out, but it is a big data table, but it allows them, it's much smaller than the old one. I think we went from like 35 to 13 metrics. And allows them to do different types of comparisons. They can drill up and down our org hierarchy. They can look at it by week or period and things like that. And they have a lot of flexibility to look at comparisons to last year and targets and things and those sorts of things. So just trying to move through this quickly. Our results and wins from the project. So I mentioned we did a pretty early survey. It's probably time for another one because we've released more content to a lot more people at this point. But at that point, we were hearing people, there was about 90% satisfaction with the tool and 80% of users finding efficiencies and saving time, with the majority finding new insights. So it's been a really successful project. That was kind of after our first wave before we made a lot of improvements as well. So I expect to see better numbers. And we've gotten some really cool anecdotal feedback as well, with people saying that it's improved their work-life balance and they're able to sleep in a few more hours because they're not trying to do some crazy Excel stuff and spending more time with their family. It's an engagement booster for their teams, and they're able to have some higher value conversations. So that's all been really fun to hear. It's been a super rewarding project. And we have one more slide about some next steps. I'm passing it back to Rebecca for that.
Yeah. Thanks, Kelsey. So Kelsey's team did a really great job of focusing on the user when they developed their reports. And we wanted to make sure we maintained that user centricity as other teams in our company continue to build reports that they wanted to deploy out to our field audience. So we formed a Power BI advisory team, and that team consists of a small group of Power users, leaders of various analytic teams, so across different functions. And then we also recruit a few of our field leaders from our user base. And the purpose is really to just ensure we have valuable, consistent reporting for our end users, and also empowering our report developers to embrace user centricity. So to do this, we first identified some of the 3 key areas that we wanted to focus on. We started primarily focusing on content, but also through that process, that review process, we also tend to provide some input on design as well. So once we identified those 3 key areas and that we wanted to start with content, we basically identified what that general process of developing a Power BI report looks like, and then identified places within that process where our advisory team could bring some value to that development. And we really designed that with the idea of being involved from the start of report development. But what we found is that we're also going to quite often have report developers who might already have an existing report that might be targeted for a different audience, maybe some leaders at our corporate office that they want to modify and adapt for our field leaders. And so we actually ended up getting a few examples of those come to us recently, which gave us an opportunity to try our process out and then iterate on that. And so some of the key considerations when we did review those reports, when our advisory team got together, we asked questions like, is this a good idea? Will it bring value? Is the data actionable? Is this relevant for long-term use, or should we set an audit date? For example, we have some reports that we've developed just specific to COVID impact. And so hopefully sometime in the near future, we'll be able to sunset some of those reports. And then also, does this content exist elsewhere in another form? Do these metrics overlap existing measures? Just really wanting to make sure we keep that content really concise. And then we also seek end user feedback. So some of those field leaders who've been participating, seeking their input on the value that this report might provide, any modifications or suggestions they have to increase the value. They really seem to like having information that is actionable, not just informative. And so this process was really helpful, especially when the report originated from a corporate audience, because they didn't seek that initial input from the field necessarily. So we were really able to provide some important feedback and help them condense things down, maybe from, this is where like our design review came in, condensing a 4-page report down to 2 pages by modifying the way that they're filtering or using drill downs and things like that. And this was also an example of the importance of collaborating and building trust among our other data users and report builders, and helping us understand and learn ways to foster better relationships among them so that we can continue to move this process forward and support user-centric BI. And that is it. Any questions?
That was awesome. I mean, just going from a lot of the suggestions you guys had with the reporting up into, I mean, even just talking about your advisory team, looks like you guys have the recipe and it's working. And so I'm hoping a lot of people on the call can take some great notes from what you guys had to share. We do have a question. Oh, go ahead.
I said, thanks for having us.
Of course. So the question we got was, do you have some kind of report catalog? Are you using Power BI in some way? Like, are you documenting even more in Power BI or in your data sources? Any suggestions on what you guys are doing with the data catalog?
Data cataloging is actually something we're hoping to adopt next year. I think that we're still identifying a tool, though, that we'll be utilizing for that.
Gotcha. Still a good question.
In terms of a report catalog, I think one thing that's interesting about Banfield is that we have different data teams within each of the departments. And, you know, we have struggled to kind of create that unified catalog. I think we maintain it within each of our individual teams. And that's one thing that the advisory team is trying to do, is trying to create some consistency and kind of unification between these teams. But I think we have an opportunity as a part of that to create something more consolidated. And maybe as a part of the data catalog, we could tag on a report catalog too.
Yeah, that's really smart to have the advisory team so you guys can just have that much more cohesiveness like kind of along with just like a huge org like that. Couple more questions. How do you handle new data requests that may not be, coming from a silo to pull from? So I'm getting from Jeff.
Yeah, so that's actually something new that we've been having to approach. We've had some of these people with reports that they want to push out to the field are on manual refresh because it's data that's not currently being stored in our warehouse. So that's actually just a brand new thing that we've been having to approach in terms of what's the best way we can help those people out in terms of being able to automate that data refresh.
Gotcha. Good tips. Yeah, I think everybody just had so many positive things to say in the chat. And, if everybody can go off mute, throw your video on, let's give Kelsey and Rebecca just a huge round of applause again thank you for being part of this. I mean, that was really insightful. That was some impressive numbers.